Hey, welcome to Once Upon a Political Time. I'm Carly. Today on the show, I am talking about government surveillance. Now, my reaction to the issue of government surveillance has historically been like my reaction to a friend asking to use my toothbrush. Fine. Like, if I think too hard about it, I wish I hadn't thought so hard about it, but honestly, whatever. I should think it's pretty gross, right? A friend scraping old food out of their teeth with the thing I use to scrape old food out of my teeth. Just like I should care that the government is undermining the Constitution in order to slowly subvert my privacy, invade my computer, phone, and internet, and gather any and all information about me they can for any future or present reason they see fit. But I just don't really that much. I just don't care. I mean, it's fine. Use my toothbrush, monitor my electronic footprint. We're all friends here. Now, partly I feel this way because, in my experience, we are all friends here. I'm a small white woman, so my relationship to government authorities has always been like my relationship to Trish, my third cousin, once removed. Friendly, loving by default, and entirely trusting, even though we don't ever see each other and really know nothing about each other. On top of that obvious privilege, the one time I tried to watch porn, at 21 years old, I cried. Which is to say, I live far away from the line of even potential digital impropriety. Ooh, go ahead, government, monitor my free people online shoe shopping addiction. Or the fact that I Google images of Central Park in springtime so I can pretend I live in a place where I have friends. So yeah, I've always subscribed to the general idea that, for the most part, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear from government spying. And I got nothing to hide. The other reason I've treated government surveillance with, at best, lighthearted disgruntlement is that I've accepted the idea that government surveillance is an important part of national security. And I mean, I like to be protected, so again, fine, watch the things I do online. I'll be over here embracing the fact that you do that as a part of my sacrifice to keep the country safe. Of course, it turns out that both these assumptions, that if you're guilty of nothing, you're safe from government surveillance abuses, and that government surveillance is an important part of national security, are arguments about as well-founded as the assertion that Santa is real because Mom told me so, and besides, who else could be eating those cookies? Fortunately, however, I had someone to help set me straight on this issue. But for that, I had to travel to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, home of the leaders of the free world and the tweeter who loves them, to talk to Thomas Drake. Drake is a former Vermonter and an NSA whistleblower. Drake made his career in the Air Force, the CIA, and as an NSA contractor before finally joining NSA itself as a senior official in the Signals Intelligence Directorate in 2001. In the wake of 9/11, Drake became deeply troubled by what he saw happening at NSA and at the massive expansion of the surveillance state. I will be sharing excerpts from my conversation with Mr. Drake throughout this episode, and his insights and deep knowledge of national intelligence institutions and practices have helped to inform this piece. For example, take a look at what happened when I suggested to Drake that people who don't do shady things on the internet don't have to worry about government surveillance. What do you say to somebody who is like, you know what, I don't do anything controversial, I, watch cat videos on the internet, why do I care if the government's picking up everything I do?
That's a form of, I have nothing to fear because I have nothing to hide. Except, how do you know what they're doing with what it is of you in terms of data, personal data, without your knowledge? Because the very phrase, you have nothing to fear, have nothing to hide, was actually stated by Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda.
That's right. I share my general justification for government surveillance with high-ranking Nazi official Joseph Goebbels. You've got nothing to fear if you have nothing Jewish about you. But the truth is, even as Drake was giving me this troubling bit of history, I found a little piece of me going, yeah, well, we're not Nazis, no matter how many Trump is fascist think pieces I read to the contrary. And then I started reading a bit more about the history of our intelligence agencies. Once upon a political time, our intelligence agencies used electronic surveillance to do messed up stuff to totally innocent people.
The Bureau began in 1937 to collect information about homosexual activity.
He wanted to identify every homosexual in the United States.
In targeting homosexuals, Hoover authorized a secret program, codenamed Sex Deviant.
Yeah, the only thing Sex Deviant should be a name for is the online alter ego persona of a pervy politician trying to send dick pics to his many mistress lovers. Any of you want Married with Kids Sex Deviant to send you up-close shot of a wrecked penis tonight? I don't know why our fictitious pervy politician is Russian. It just kind of came out like that. Actually, once upon a lot of political times, our intelligence agencies used electronic surveillance to do messed up stuff to totally innocent people.
Any black leader with charisma was a target of the government's COINTELPRO program.
An FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who had a pathological hatred of Martin Luther King, so much so that he directed his own agents to break the law repeatedly in going after King and taping King and having illegal surveillance on King.
And he clearly tried to destroy Martin.
Yeah. In fact, the FBI sent threatening letters to Dr. King that used vague but ominous language that is and was believed to be aimed at getting King to commit suicide by blackmailing him with information about his extramarital affairs, information that had been obtained by the FBI through a variety of electronic and physical surveillance practices. Can you believe that? Now, I know there are probably a lot of marginalized communities in this country collectively going, yeah! But yeah, I didn't really know the specifics about our history in this way. I mean, some of the very surveillance practices that people have tried and failed to get me to care about that are going on right now are the exact same practices that were used back in the day to target people for being gay or black and charismatic. Practices like the bulk collection of American phone records. So earlier when I said, well, we're not Nazis, I think I meant, well, we're not Nazis. Of course, this is exactly what Drake was talking about when he said, how do you know what they're doing with what it is about you in terms of data without your knowledge? To be gay is innocent. To be black and charismatic is innocent. Yet in the past, the government has seen these traits as inherently suspicious and dangerous. All of this, obviously, put a dent in my faith in the intelligence community and their ability to use the massive amounts of data they have collected responsibly. Which isn't to say I don't also have a profound respect for the national intelligence agencies and the brave and important work they do to keep the country safe. It is to say that, as with any human organization who has been given tremendous data and therefore power, there is a profound potential and, in fact, temptation to abuse that data and power.
It's extraordinary. I can tell you it's extraordinarily tempting. When you're in those positions of power and you're given that power, it's ripe for abuse. History's just not kind here. It's just not.
And this is why these organizations must be kept in check, their powers limited and regulated. Unfortunately, the behavior of Hoover and the FBI and other intelligence agencies did ultimately get checked. In the 1970s, a series of congressional investigations uncovered what had been happening within the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, and fortunately, Congress was pretty shocked.
Most of the senators now agree with Chairman Frank Church that the CIA has indeed been a rogue elephant out of control.
Indeed, a rogue elephant out of control, a wild water buffalo with no limits, ne'er-do-well raccoons without restraint, doctors without borders.
In response to these revelations, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA, in 1978. Now, understanding FISA is crucial to understanding why people have been so outraged by the resurgence of government surveillance in the last decade. Before FISA, one of, if not the best protection against government surveillance was the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. That's the one that says that government needs to get a warrant based on probable cause in order to search or seize a person's house, paper, or effects. Like the saying that I just made up goes, first is the worst, second is the best, fourth is the one that protects your effects. That's a little amendment humor for you there. Except the first is definitely not the worst, and the second is definitely not the best, so I take that back. Regardless, FISA helped bring the Fourth Amendment into the digital age by effectively saying that government needed a warrant for electronic searches and seizures as well. In fact, it went even further than that. FISA made it almost outright illegal to perform electronic surveillance against U.S. persons. There were necessarily some exceptions to that, but for the most part, electronically spying on Americans was a hard no. FISA also said that electronic surveillance against foreign entities, which is to say pretty much the only acceptable kind of electronic surveillance, could only be performed after the agency had gotten a warrant from the FISA court, a secret court established by FISA for the purpose of granting warrants to intelligence agencies to perform surveillance. You got that? Pretty much no spying on Americans, and you can only spy on foreigners when you have probable cause and then get a warrant. Because let's be clear, there are only two kinds of people in this world suspicious enough to deserve to be spied on without restraint or a proper warrant. Mimes and people who don't like Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run album. That's it. I don't trust anyone who chooses to make not talking the foundation of their professional life. And anyone who doesn't like Born to Run has black tar in their soul. That's actually just a fact. In this way, FISA established the standard for how intelligence agencies could use electronic surveillance, and it is critically important in preventing another Hoover FBI situation. And for decades, this FISA prohibition on spying on Americans was the supreme legal regime at NSA. And that legal regime was very clear that you should never turn these instruments onto U.S. persons.
Couldn't. In fact, there was criminal sanctions that preclude if you went warrantless, you were in violation.
That's right. No one was going warrantless at NSA until 2001. For obvious reasons, 9/11 upended the national security status quo that had been in place since FISA was passed in 1978. Let's look at a very abridged run-through of what happened from a national security perspective in the wake of that tragedy. In October, a month after 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act grants agencies like the FBI sweeping surveillance power over cell phone data, internet search histories, medical histories, library records, and any tangible thing for suspected terrorists.
That's right. The Patriot Act actually amended FISA, giving intelligence agencies vast new powers for collecting data and pursuing both terrorist organizations and lone wolf terrorists at home and abroad. Now, there has been a lot of criticism through the years over intelligence agencies' overly broad interpretation of what they can do according to the Patriot Act. Somewhat famously, even the authors of the Patriot Act have expressed grave concerns about intelligence agents' implementation of, specifically, Section 215 of the Patriot Act. In one congressional hearing, one of the Patriot Act's authors, Senator James Sensenbrenner, asked the then FBI Director Robert Mueller, point blank, how it was that the FBI had believed that Section 215 allowed them to initiate bulk collection of American records from businesses. Mueller's response used English words.
I can tell you generally that there is the belief that the body of telephone toll data has in that information that is relevant, may be relevant, in the future has been relevant in the past, and that its collection in this matter thereby satisfies the requirement for relevance.
What? Words that in the future were once in the past, words henceforth thereby once relevant words? If I words, will you forget that in the past I violated American civil liberties words, if I words? And yet, it is understandable and expected that in the wake of 9/11, the government and intelligence agencies would ratchet up their national security practices. More disturbing is the fact that even as the Patriot Act was being debated and ultimately passed in Congress, Bush, Cheney, and a tiny number of other select individuals were simultaneously implementing a secret program at NSA, codenamed Stellar Wind, that violated the Patriot Act. That's right, even while Congress was passing and intelligence agencies were generously interpreting the Patriot Act, the White House was secretly violating it. So what was Stellar Wind doing to necessitate such secrecy? I asked Thomas Drake. So why was it so secret?
Special because it was taking the power of NSA and turning it on the United States and treating the United States as if we're a foreign nation for the purposes of blanket dragnet electronic surveillance. It is.
Now, blanket dragnet electronic surveillance is one of those phrases that if you've paid any attention to the government surveillance debate of the last decade, you've probably heard. And if you're anything like me, you've always found kind of meaningless. Like, it's just hard to really connect to or worry about on an emotional level. Incidentally, you've also probably heard blanket dragnet electronic surveillance if you've ever attended a celebrity baby naming party. Brad and I are going with dragnet for the girl and surveillance for the boy. Like 2 words, surveillance. What Drake is saying, though, is this. Stellar Wind allowed NSA to collect U.S. persons' data in bulk, and therefore to spy on U.S. persons, often without a warrant, defying the heart of FISA, which, again, is the thing that was put in place to prevent another round of horrible civil liberty abuses on innocent people, like civil rights heroes and gay people. It also defies the Fourth Amendment and the Patriot Act on so many levels. As I mentioned earlier, NSA even started working with telecommunications companies to collect American phone records in bulk. Like in the 1960s, when intelligence agencies worked with telecommunication companies to collect American phone records in bulk. And also when the intelligence agencies treated the personal enemies of FBI directors like the disavowed member of an Italian mob family.
You were like a brother to me. To all of us.
What an era of national intelligence we are now emulating. Can you imagine if Hoover had had access to the Google searches and email correspondences of every American during his effort to identify every gay American? It is terrifying to think about. And the secrecy of it makes it even more terrifying. I mean, if this level of surveillance, this massive sweep of American data, was so important for national security after 9/11, why didn't the White House simply push to make the Patriot Act even broader? In effect, to legalize Stellar Wind by incorporating the key elements of it into the Patriot Act. Thomas Drake had a similar question. In the following clip, he describes what happened when he brought it up to a lead NSA attorney.
When I confronted the lead attorney, which Vito Potenza, in which I'm saying we're in violation of the Constitution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and you said 18. If the law that's on the books is insufficient for the day and the threat, guess what you do? You go back to Congress. Congress would have signed off on just about anything. He said, with what we want to do, they'll say no. So, the hair's like almost standing to the back of my neck, because it's like, why wouldn't you go to Congress to modify, make it more flexible, still Fourth Amendment?
To modify FISA.
Yes! And he's telling me if we do that, Congress will say no.
Also, the name of the NSA attorney he mentions, in case you didn't catch it, is Vito Potenza. So my mob reference just got a little too real. Basically, in the wake of 9/11, the Bush White House decided that the laws stipulated in FISA should be treated the way most Americans treat serving sizes on nutrition labels, as general suggestions, guidelines, should we choose to accept them, which of course we don't. Literally, someone explained to me how this is a 14-serving bag. I know, it looks kind of big, but half of it is air. I should not be made to feel guilty for eating the entirety of a bag that doesn't even have the integrity to be entirely full. But that's not the point. The point is that the White House was clearly violating a bunch of laws. Despite this, members of the White House, and particularly former NSA Director Michael Hayden, have argued that everything they did was perfectly legal because it fell under the president's authority as commander-in-chief to initiate a program like Stellar Wind. This is something Thomas Drake finds really disturbing. Listen to Drake's response when he heard former NSA Director Michael Hayden invoke just such an argument.
So when asked, when he was confronted politely, right, what was the legal basis for these secret programs, he said 3 words, and chilling: raw executive authority, quote unquote. When I ask college level students what form of government takes the form of raw executive authority, I never hear anybody ever say democracy or a constitutional republic. It's usually something approaching a despotic regime or totalitarianism, or other isms that tend to have a command and control, top down, right,
I mean, he's not wrong. Think about that. About the idea that the government can break the law if the president says it's okay for the government to break the law. It's like the president just got all bad parent on the country and was like, do as I say, darling, not as I do. Of course, above all, NSA has tried to excuse these programs by arguing that they are essential for national security. Which brings us back to that second reason that I've always found it hard to get really upset about government surveillance. If it's keeping us safe, maybe it's worth it, right? But what if it's not keeping us safe? Drake argues, in fact, that NSA's mass surveillance program is actually making us less safe because it is creating a bigger metaphorical haystack in which to find the metaphorical terrorist needles. When you are storing trillions of bytes of data and communications, it's that much harder to find the thing you actually need, the threats.
Here's the problem. If you want to suck the ocean dry, how do you know what drops matter? Or you want to remove all the sand off the beach?
How do they know?
You don't. Part of the problem is you end up it's garbage in, garbage out. It makes it very difficult to properly sort through when you're bringing everything in. But the temptations are enormous because the technology makes it so easy.
So temptations for what?
Just to suck it all up.
Oh.
Save it, store it.
So Hayden would argue that there's been real national security threats thwarted because of these programs, and that this has been a success.
Well, the most famous one when it came up in Congress, right? They claimed 54, and then it turned out there might be one. Then it turned out that we would have found it by traditional means, which was some money that was sent to Al-Shabaab in Somalia. That was like the only one remaining after they claimed 54.
54 people had been thwarted.
54 plots
had been thwarted.
And then so when they're asked to prove it, this is where it comes up short.
Which is pretty much the only place where it's important for NSA not to come up short.
It's like saying, yeah, we couldn't cure the man's cancer, but the research and science behind that experimental treatment was awesome, so let's keep using it. With that said, I've read former NSA Director Michael Hayden's book, Playing to the Edge, and he seems to genuinely believe that these surveillance programs are imperative. But that gets to the very heart of what's so tricky about this issue. It's hard to question an argument that invokes national security, and the guys defending these programs know that and use it to their advantage. Here's Drake again.
And much of this can be under the cover and mantle of national security. National security gets invoked so often now. You don't understand, Tom. This is our national security. As if national security somehow, as soon as you invoke it, you're exempt from all questions, all responsibility, all accountability. It's national security. I call it the state religion. And if you dare question it, guess what? Well, you might get excommunicated.
I do love a good metaphor. So here's another one. National security gets invoked a little like menstruation. Most of the time, it's a totally valid justification for a given behavior. Like, for example, eating 14 servings of brownie brittle, especially when you consider that half the bag is filled with air, not brownies. But every so often, it's really just a front for being shady. Yeah, I can't come to work today, feminine reasons. In fact, the two can actually be used pretty similarly. Yeah, I'm going to use the NSA's vast resources and technology to spy on the communication between my boyfriend and that pretty coworker of his because it's that time of the month. I mean, national security reasons. He's totally a communist. In fact, suspected ties to communists is the exact front Hoover used to investigate and torment Martin Luther King. Hoover said that King could be a threat to national security, as were gays, in case you were wondering.
Homosexuality was outside of the FBI's jurisdiction, but Hoover argued that homosexuals posed a national security threat.
Yeah, it turns out Hoover didn't want to come out and say he was a racist, homophobic bigot who abused his power in order to abuse gays and African Americans. He was worried about national security. It also turns out NSA officials today might themselves be hiding some of their true motivations. Drake has been very public about the extent to which decisions at NSA are often made according to profits and corporate interest. Classic. Unfortunately, I can't get into the who's and what's of that here, though you can learn more about it in the prologue to this episode, link below. But I did want to highlight the following excerpt from my conversation with Drake. You said that many millionaires and multimillionaires were made at NSA in the wake of 9/11. What role do you think profit chasing or lining your own pockets played in the way NSA developed after 9/11?
So after 9/11, I remember going around the campus with the person I reported to was a number 3 person at NSA. It was also my hiring manager, Maureen Baginski. She was the Signals Intelligence Director of the Signals Intelligence Directorate. And when asked, because we knew we'd failed the nation. We didn't keep people out of harm's way. That was our fundamental responsibility. Keep people out of harm's way. We didn't do that. People really felt it. Right? This is something that's not often discussed. Except at the higher levels, they were in denial. So when asked, we failed the nation. Oh, no. 9/11 was a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money we want and then some. Wow. You could have, people's jaws were dropping. Many, many billions of dollars were pumped into NSA and rest of the government in terms of national security and defense as a result of the failure to protect the nation.
Do you think they were under-resourced prior to 9/11?
No, actually not. That's been one of the excuses they made.
So on that disheartening note, here's one interpretation of where things stand today. NSA and other security agencies have a history of abusing power when they've been granted it. They also have a history of copping to corporate interests over the interests of the nation in order to line the pockets of themselves and their friends. This has led to a slew of security failures, including 9/11. Despite this, NSA and other security agencies have been rewarded over the past 16 years with more power and more resources. They have then, in turn, used these powers and resources to subvert the Constitution and Americans' rights. Basically, we're on the road to 1984. Next stop, fascist surveillance state. Now, maybe this particular assessment fits perfectly into your worldview of government and security agencies as corrupt vehicles of power-mongering. Or maybe you're like me and you find that's just a little too cynical for your preferred emotional diet of optimism and ultimate righteousness. Or maybe you're like me and you've read Playing to the Edge, Michael Hayden's book, and you believe that Hayden is a thoughtful guy who actually may have had good intentions with Stellar Wind, or at the very least, didn't have visions of tyranny dancing through his head. If you're in any of these latter two camps, let me propose a compromise. Maybe Hayden is a good guy. Maybe George Bush had good intentions when he signed off on Stellar Wind, and Obama had good intentions when he decided to keep many elements of Stellar Wind. There doesn't have to be a villain in this Brothers Grimm fairy tale. But that doesn't change the fact that many of these programs still seem to be unlawful and unconstitutional. And perhaps more importantly, what happens when we get a Hoover instead of a Hayden? In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think American democracy is on the brink of collapse or that fascism lurks right around the corner. But I do think we are walking a fine line that, frankly, more of us should be a little more disturbed by. So, for my part, I'm making a change. Instead of treating government surveillance like a friend asking to borrow my toothbrush, I'm going to treat it like I would a friend asking to borrow my dirty underwear, with horror and concern. So that's it. I want to give a big, big thanks to Thomas Drake for taking the time to talk to me and walk me through the many nuances of American national security policy. I'd like to say I understand how it all works perfectly now, but wow, do I not understand it. I would also really encourage everyone to go to the prologue to this episode, link here, to hear more from Drake and learn about his story. His is a fascinating, albeit disheartening one, about government failure and abuse. Plus, it gets into my favorite amendment, the First. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for watching, and follow me on Twitter because I need an excuse to tweet, and I currently don't have any incentive to. And that handle is Carly P. Riley. Bam. A little ad-libbing at the end, but what else?